Now, of course, when we talk about Schumann and Brahms together, it's not just a pair, it's a trio. You also have to talk about Clara Schumann, Schumann's wife and widow, and the great love of Brahms's life, possibly the great love of Clara's life after her beloved husband's death. And so when you put the pieces together, you feel an extraordinary family history. I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, Schumann was a real Renaissance man in so many ways, so many different gifts. And in his early years, he was probably more of a writer, I mean, almost a poetic writer, than a composer. Given his mental condition, which we would now call something like manic depression, when he did finally compose, everything was within a very, very short time, and he composed in a kind of fever, because he could only compose when he was in his manic state. And so, in fact, people have worked out that his music was written actually faster than the music of Mozart, who was always held up as the person who could produce music almost by automatic writing. He was not only a writer and a composer, but was a scholar of early music. Now, he probably really the first great scholar of early music who knew everything that was before him. And of course, this he passed on to Brahms, who was not exactly his pupil, but was his friend. I would say Schumann was his mentor. And of course, Brahms was always in his debt. Schumann taught him so much. He also taught him about the history that had gone before him and gave him his library, which is why Brahms was able to write one of his first great pieces, the German Requiem, so much under the influence of early music, particularly Schütz, which he otherwise would not have known. And of course, Brahms was in this astonishing situation of being with the person who had given him his most inspiration and support, almost living with them and at the same time being in love with his wife. And this affected Brahms's life and his music to an extent which simply can't be overstated. And it's very interesting when you think of the mottos of composers. Schumann's motto was frei aber einsam, free but lonely, which tells you already about the two sides of his personality and hints at the self-destruction which was always in his nature. When Brahms wrote his third symphony, he changed this motto to frei aber froh, free but happy, which is not only an typically ironic gesture back to Schumann, but also tells you everything about Brahms, who was, of course, free but miserable, was unable to make a permanent relationship of any type, and free but happy. Basically, I suppose now would translate as, yes, whatever my life has been, I'm surviving. But one thinks of Brahms as this very gruff, reserved man, but one forgets, first of all, what his teenage years had been. He spent a lot of his free time playing the piano in bars and brothels, and this seems simply to have crippled him emotionally. Part of the problem with his life was that women were either saints or total sinners, And in a way, it would be absolutely typical that he would fall in love with the most unattainable person in Europe, at least for him. And so much of his music, one can hear this process being worked through. Now, from the First Symphony, this picture of darkness to light, very much inspired by Beethoven. But also when you see the first version of the First Symphony, it starts without the introduction, which he wrote after hearing Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Well, you can hear it pulsing through the work. But also one sees what it is, the idea of a love death for him. When he writes the Third Symphony, I see the story of the Schumann family and his relation to it all the way through to the end of the third movement, which is one of the most bittersweet pieces ever written. And then from the finale of the Third Symphony, Clara seems to leave his symphonic life entirely. The Fourth Symphony is his facing of mortality. Then he's finally dealing only with himself. It's interesting when you put these great symphonies together, because Schumann was often somehow in the shadow of Brahms, and even I've often felt that musicians play his music more like Brahms than is absolutely necessary. Schumann is a very different type of spirit, where Brahms is patient and wary. Schumann is impatient and completely open and candid. In some of the great slow movements in these pieces, particularly in the Adagio of the Second Symphony, I don't think there is anywhere in which you can see a more honest portrait of a composer as man. Utterly unself-pitying, but deeply tragic. Now, he said about the Second Symphony to a friend, he wrote, saying, I think you can tell how ill I was when I wrote this symphony, how desperate I was. But by the time the finale comes, I'm sure you can see that all the clouds are lifted. Im Gegenteil, as we say in England. For me, the finale, whatever he thinks, still is almost a piece of desperation. It moves so fast, it's so active, it's so busy. It's as though he's trying to fight against his fate and his personality and his sense of self-destruction. When you listen to the Third Symphony of Schumann, which was designed to be a popular piece about the Rhine and its area and its people and its musical sense, you see Schumann absolutely managed this up until the fourth movement, which Clara wrote to Brahms saying, Robert has written an astonishing new piece, but there's a movement in it that I cannot make head or tail of, I can't understand at all. And suddenly in this fourth movement, which people for over 100 years have been saying is a portrait of Cologne Cathedral, one feels Schumann's demons reaching up. It's as though he's been grabbed by the snakes which will pull him down. And it's a deeply traumatic piece, however much it looks back to early music. And the last movement after it starts in a way as though it is almost trying to comfort. The music is trying to comfort the composer and say, no, that was just a nightmare. It's going to be fine. And it's the finale is marked at the beginning with a sign I've never seen before, which is forte dolce, meaning somehow present but tender. as though you're trying to look after someone you're worried about. The Fourth Symphony of Schumann is also another extraordinary psychological document, because he revised the piece. He wrote the piece, of course, in his manic state. And the piece in its first version, which I play, comes out as obviously a very serious piece in D minor, but also a piece with lightness and joy and motion. He revised it in one of his deepest depressions later in his life, which is the version which is normally played. And for me, I know of no other piece of music which has had such a treatment, because you feel the depth of depression in the revision. And he has managed to drag this music, which flies in the air, absolutely to the ground, as though it's crawling along the ground, as in the famous Mark Morris choreography of the piano quintet. And with basically the same notes, it can give you such a different impression. It's as though you've seen the piece have a lobotomy. And so this will be very fascinating for me to play the first version of this piece, which is called the Fourth Symphony, although it came actually second chronologically, with Brahms's Fourth Symphony, which is the piece in which he is facing the prospect of his own mortality. We owe the knowledge of the first version of the Fourth Symphony only to Brahms, because the first performance of the original version had been such a catastrophe. Clara forbade all further performances of it, and Schumann lost his confidence. That Brahms studied the piece and thought, no, this is actually a much better piece as it is, and it is more the spirit of Schumann. And so he had it published at his own expense, something which came close to completely breaking the relationship between him and Clara. There was a couple of years where there was no contact. I mean, she was more furious than she had ever been with him. So yet again, the contact between these composers, even after the death of one, proves to be so vital, so important. But there's an interesting dichotomy, because Schumann is not in any sense a Viennese composer in that line. With this line of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, this is the line that leads to Brahms. And the Schumann line is a different one. He is really a very German composer. And of course, Brahms is also a very German composer, but he's utterly influenced by this line of Vienna. If you listen to the music of C.P. Bach, for instance, you get the idea of a lot of where Schumann is. Again, it's his early music influence, but also of Mendelssohn and the Mendelssohn Orchestra and the Mendelssohn lightness. And so for me, it will be fascinating to see how each composer influences each other. I'm sure that Schumann will have more of an effect on Brahms than the other way around. I mean, it should be chronologically anyway. But also, because we so often play Brahms so massively, I think the lightness and the airiness, at the feet off the groundness of Schumann, if that word exists, will have an effect on Brahms's music. And very often, Brahms is looking back to Schumann. If you listen to the two middle movements of the First Symphony, you can see how much Schumann is there. And the outer movements are almost slapping that away, saying, here is Beethoven. Here I must be the follower of Beethoven. And I think that's also somehow a split personality from Brahms. So I think it will be fascinating. The pieces are, of course, very, very central to the orchestra. And for us, it will be absolutely fascinating to play these 8 great pieces together within 4 days. It will really be a crash course in what they share and in their differences. And I'm sure we are going to find out lots of fascinating things from their juxtaposition and from working on them in such a concentrated manner.